What if everything you've heard about demons isn't actually coming from the Bible? For centuries, people have imagined demons as terrifying creatures with horns, wings, and monstrous faces. These images are everywhere, in movies, art, and stories. But what if those ideas were shaped more by culture than by Scripture itself? Today, we're going to step away from assumptions and return to the original text. We'll explore what the Bible truly says about demons, not what tradition added, not what fiction invented, but what is actually written. And what we find might be far more unsettling than anything you've imagined. When most people think about demons, this is the image that comes to mind. A red creature, horns on its head, holding a pitchfork, maybe even ruling over some fiery underworld. But here's the problem: none of that comes from the Bible. Not the horns, not the red skin, not the pitchfork. These ideas developed much later, influenced by medieval art, folklore, and even political symbolism. Over time, they became so familiar that many people assume they are biblical. But if we're serious about understanding Scripture, we have to separate what is written from what was imagined. To understand what demons are, we need to go back to the source, the biblical texts themselves. In the Old Testament, references are rare and often indirect. In the New Testament, however, demons appear more clearly, especially in the accounts of Jesus' ministry. But even there, they are not described visually in detail. Instead, the focus is on what they do, how they influence people, how they speak, and how they respond to divine authority. This tells us something important. The Bible is less concerned with their appearance and far more concerned with their nature and actions. In Scripture, demons are not presented as visible monsters roaming the world. Instead, they are described as spiritual beings, unseen, yet active. They operate in ways that are often hidden, influencing thoughts, actions, and circumstances. This makes them far more difficult to recognize and far more dangerous. Because something you cannot see is something you might not question. And that's exactly where the biblical perspective becomes more serious than the popular image. The real concern isn't what demons look like, but how they work. One of the most important things to understand is that in the Bible, demonic activity is often subtle. It's not always about dramatic possession or extreme behavior. In many cases, the influence is quiet, gradual, and almost unnoticeable. A thought here, a temptation there, a shift in perception that slowly changes how a person sees the world. This kind of influence doesn't draw attention to itself. It blends in with normal human experience. And because of that, it can go completely undetected. The danger is not always in overwhelming control, but in quiet persuasion. In the Gospels, we do see more direct encounters with demons, especially in the ministry of Jesus. These moments are often intense, but they reveal something very specific. Demons recognize authority. They respond to it. They speak, they react, and ultimately, they obey. This tells us that whatever their nature is, they are not equal forces in a cosmic battle. They are subject to a higher power. And the emphasis is not on their strength, but on the authority that overcomes them. That distinction is essential to understanding the biblical perspective. In several parts of Scripture, there is also a connection made between demonic forces and idolatry, not always directly, but clearly enough to raise serious questions. Behind false systems of worship, behind distorted beliefs, there may be more than just human imagination. The Bible suggests that deception can operate on a spiritual level, shaping entire cultures, influencing what people believe to be true. This expands the idea of demonic activity far beyond individuals. It becomes something that can affect entire groups, even entire societies. At its core, the biblical description of demonic activity centers around one key idea: deception. Not always fear, not always chaos, but confusion, distortion, and misdirection. If something can influence what you believe, it can influence how you live. And if that influence is subtle enough, you may never realize it's happening. That's why the Bible places such a strong emphasis on truth, awareness, and discernment. Because the real danger is not always what is obvious, but what goes unquestioned. If we follow the pattern described in Scripture, one of the primary areas of influence is the human mind. Not in a dramatic, obvious way, but in small, almost invisible shifts. A suggestion that feels like your own thought, a doubt that slowly grows stronger over time, a belief that forms without you even noticing where it came from. The Bible repeatedly emphasizes the importance of guarding the mind, testing what is true, and being aware of what shapes your thinking. Because once a belief is established, it begins to guide actions, decisions, and, ultimately, a person's entire direction in life. Influence over thoughts eventually becomes influence over choices, and choices, over time, shape an entire life. The Bible often presents life as a path, a series of decisions that lead somewhere. If those decisions are guided by truth, the path is clear. But if they are shaped by distortion or deception, the direction changes. Not always dramatically at first, but gradually. A small step in the wrong direction can become a completely different destination over time. This is how subtle influence becomes powerful, not instantly, but progressively. In some cases, the Bible describes a deeper level of influence, not just suggestion, but a kind of spiritual bondage. And even here, it rarely begins in an obvious way. It starts with repeated patterns. Habits that seem small at first, decisions that are made over and over again. Eventually, those patterns become difficult to break. What once felt like a choice begins to feel like something you cannot escape. This is how influence can grow into control, not suddenly, but step by step over time. But the biblical message does not end with influence or control. It also speaks about freedom. Just as influence can grow over time, so can clarity, truth, and restoration. The same scriptures that warn about deception also emphasize the power of truth to break it. Light exposes what is hidden. Awareness changes perspective, and once something is clearly seen, it can be confronted. This is a central theme, not fear, but understanding, not helplessness, but the possibility of change. When we compare different parts of the Bible, an interesting pattern begins to appear. In the Old Testament, references to demonic beings are rare, often indirect, and sometimes debated in interpretation. But in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, the presence of demons becomes much more visible. This shift is significant. It doesn't necessarily mean that demons were absent before, but rather that the focus changes. The narrative becomes more direct, more confrontational, and more revealing. This transition helps us understand that the Bible is not just describing isolated events, but unfolding a larger story. Another important detail in Scripture is how differently people respond to spiritual influence. Not everyone reacts the same way. Some seem unaware, others are deeply affected, and some recognize what is happening and respond with clarity. This tells us that influence is not just about the external force, it also involves the internal state of the person. Awareness, belief, understanding, all of these play a role. The same influence can have very different outcomes depending on how it is received. The Bible consistently frames this entire topic as a contrast between truth and deception, not as a battle of equal forces, but as a tension between what is real and what is distorted. Deception doesn't always look false at first glance. In fact, it often appears convincing, logical, even appealing. That's what makes it effective. If something looked completely false, it would be easy to reject. But when truth is mixed with distortion, it becomes much harder to recognize. And that is where discernment becomes essential. In the end, the focus of Scripture is not to create fear, but to bring clarity. The goal is not to make people obsessed with darkness, but to understand how it operates so it no longer has the same power. When something is hidden, it can influence quietly, but when it is exposed, it loses that advantage. This is why understanding matters, because awareness changes how you think, how you decide, and how you live. And once you begin to see clearly, everything else starts to shift. If we take everything we've seen and step back for a moment, a larger picture begins to form. The Bible does not limit spiritual influence to isolated individuals or rare events. Instead, it suggests something broader, something that can extend across cultures, systems, and even entire societies. Influence that shapes ideas, values, and beliefs on a large scale. Not always in obvious ways, but through patterns that repeat over time. This expands the conversation beyond personal experience into something much bigger.
But within that larger picture, the Bible also presents a clear response, not fear, but light. Light represents truth, awareness, and understanding. Even a small amount of light can change how everything is perceived. What once seemed confusing becomes clear. And what was hidden loses its influence. When truth becomes the foundation, everything begins to stabilize. Decisions become clearer. Direction becomes more defined. Influence may still exist, but it no longer has the same power, because it is recognized. And once something is seen clearly, it can no longer control in the same way. So what does the Bible actually say about demons? Not what culture imagined, but what is written. It describes unseen influence, subtle deception, and the need for awareness. It shifts the focus away from appearance and toward understanding. And once you see that clearly, everything changes.